Today we will be learning about the causes of the American War for Independence and how the colonists reacted to unfair laws and taxes set up by the British. The French and Indian War was the first cause in the American War for Independence. The French and British were both fighting over the Ohio River Valley area for settlements and trade. Native Americans played a big role in this war by playing the European powers against each other for their benefit, but eventually sided with the French. There were many failed attempts by the British, led by George Washington, to take the French troops out of the Ohio River Valley, but they were failed. In 1757, the French lost its advantages in the war, and they signed the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which stopped France from fighting and gave Britain all of their land in America. The British spent loads of money fighting the natives and the French, and they were highly in debt, so they taxed the colonists harshly and unfairly. The colonists were outraged with the British, and these taxes led to the Revolution. Pontiac's Rebellion is the next cause, and this occurred when the natives thought that they could weaken the British to bring the French back into the war. They also needed guns and more powder, and without the French they didn't have those things. In 1763, natives captured British forts in the Ohio River Valley and raided many British settlements. Unfortunately, Pontiac's Rebellion was not successful because the natives couldn't capture forts at Detroit, Niagara, or Fort Pitt. The war was very costly against the natives, so Thomas Gage, a British general, decided to give Indians respect because it cost less than fighting. The Proclamation of 1763 was declared by the British King, ordering all the colonists to remain east of the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists were furious at the British because they just fought this long war and now they were not allowed to live in the land that they won. The British realized that they had very little control over the colonists with these uprisings, so they decided to take a direct control of the colonies. This led to tension and great hatred between the colonists and England. The Grenville Acts were the third cause for the America's War for Independence. They were created by George Grenville. They were established because Britain's debt doubled after the French and Indian War, and they felt that the colonists should pay off this debt because the war was fought to protect them. So these acts were set up to tax sugar and all paper-like goods. The first one was the Sugar Acts, which lowered the tax on sugar in hope that the colonists would start to buy from the British, but also to harshly prosecute smugglers and get them out of the colonies. The Stamp Acts were Britain's first direct tax in the colonies, and they taxed all printed goods like paper, books, stamps, anything with paper was taxed. The colonists realized that they were pretty much paying off Britain's debt for them, and they grew very angry. It was unfair, and they were being taxed without representation. This led to the Revolution. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty were organized groups that were opposed to British taxes and laws. They created boycotts on all imported goods from Britain that had taxes on them. Their boycotts were actually very effective, and they got the Stamp Act repealed in 1766. Samuel Adams was a famous leader of the Sons of Liberty, and he organized many violent attacks on tax collectors living in the colonies. The tax collectors were fearing for their lives, so they requested that British soldiers come and occupy Boston to protect them. The colonists were furious when the British soldiers occupied Boston because they had to live in their homes and they were forcing them to buy from the British and affecting their daily life routine. Before the Boston Massacre occurred, the Townshend Acts were passed, which were indirect taxes on necessities. Many riots and protests broke out after these acts, and after the acts were repealed, these protests kept going on against British occupying Boston. When the British seized the ship Liberty, and the Crown sent 4,000 extra troops to stop riots in Boston, the colonists became furious. A group of rioters one night started throwing clubs and rocks at British soldiers. After being asked to stop, the soldiers fired, killing 5 colonists. Patriots, in an attempt to raise morale, called this the Boston Massacre. This is a rendition of what happened by Paul Revere. Parliament started to back down, and the British withdrew their troops from the colonies after the Boston Massacre and also dropped all Townshend Acts. Parliament kept only one tax, and that was the harsh tax on tea. The colonists could finally live their lives without redcoats taking their jobs and firing on their friends. Although the British left Boston, the colonists were still furious on the tax on tea and the damage they had done in the Boston Massacre. The British were well aware that the colonists were smuggling tea into the colonies, and they decided to lower their tax on tea so the colonists would buy from them. The colonists thought the British were trying to trick them, so they refused to buy from them. On December 16, 1773, patriots and many members of the Sons of Liberty dressed as Indians and boarded 3 British ships filled with tea and dumped all the valuables into the harbor. This was the Boston Tea Party. It was an active protest, and the British had to act upon it. After the Boston Tea Party and the $4 million worth of tea lost, the British closed the port of Boston and sent their troops back to occupy the city. The Intolerable Acts were created after the Boston Tea Party, and it closed the port of Boston and forced colonists to house British troops. The colonists rejected the idea that the British could shut down trade and change their colonial government, but the royal governor of England banned town meetings, so they had to meet in houses secretly. Massachusetts colonists specifically reacted with violence and forced court of laws to shut down. They assaulted anyone who accepted an office under the governor or obeyed Parliament. The colonists were urging the British to fight back and start a revolution. The colonists were finally ready to fight for freedom. The First Continental Congress was a group of delegates that met in 1774 that represented every colony except Georgia. They created boycotts on all British imports and created a new government in the colonies stronger than Parliament. The Congress discussed how to repeal the coercive acts. Because town hall meetings were banned, many representatives in Suffolk County in Massachusetts met in their homes in Milton and Dedham to discuss British mistreatment of the colonists. Although freedom was not on the mind of the First Continental Congress, building a defensive militia and fighting back against the British was. The Battle of Lexington and Concord began on April 19, 1775, when General Gage tried arresting John Hancock and Samuel Adams in Lexington. He was also after the stockpile of colonist weapons in Concord. Colonists were able to see the British approaching, and even though they were farmers in the army, they prepared and fought them off. When the British turned to return back to Boston, colonists lined the road and ambushed them, making their retreat very difficult. The British had never fought a war like this before, and they were in deep shock. The colonists were well prepared for these battles and had men warning them when the British were approaching so they could hide important figures and, more importantly, their weapons. The British made General Thomas Gage the governor of Massachusetts because he was a military leader. They tried to make sure that no revolts arose, but that did not go as planned. The colonists started taking control over many cities and ports and started imposing their own rules and laws. This shift in war led to the Second Continental Congress and the Declaration of Independence. In May of 1775, delegates from all colonies came to Philadelphia to form the Second Continental Congress. The Second Continental Congress came together to get colonial unity after the battles of Lexington and Concord and prepare the colonies for other battles. Radicals in this group at the time wanted independence, but mainly they were fighting for no taxes. 1776, Thomas Paine wrote a book called Common Sense, which proposed independence from Britain and allowed people to elect all of their government. This persuaded many people to fight for independence, and it no longer became a radical wish. After the Olive Branch petition sent by the Second Continental Congress to England was rejected, America started to function as its own country, and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia proposed writing the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence based off Thomas Paine's views and common sense, and based off the idea that all men are created equal. John Hancock's signature is the most important on the Declaration of Independence because he is the president of the Second Continental Congress, which was America's first government. The Declaration of Independence was made up of 4 parts: a preamble, Declaration of Natural Rights, a Bill of Indictments, and a Declaration of Independence. The preamble explains the purpose of the document and why America wants to be independent. The Declaration of Natural Rights refers to Locke's theory on government and that God gives everyone natural rights. It also refers to that a government creates laws, and if the citizens are loyal, then everyone has natural rights. The government is made to protect the natural rights of the citizens, but if they aren't protecting those natural rights, the citizens can leave the government. The Bill of Indictments explains how Britain violated these natural rights and didn't protect the citizens. They specifically refer to King George's and his fault in this. And finally, to wrap up, the Declaration of Independence was written to explain that because Britain violated these rights, the United States is free to break away from its rule. These are the causes that led to the American Revolution.